How do we explain the massive amount of suffering around us if a good God exists? According to Stephen Law, one popular response is to appeal to mystery. In some mysterious fashion, the suffering we and other creatures experience is all for the best. In some incomprehensible way, this is the kind of world a good God would create, despite the fact that it contains enormous quantities of horrendous suffering. Punting to mystery in this way is a very popular strategy for dealing with troubling evidence that seems to point towards the non-existence of a benevolent God. Is this a good response, though? In this video, I'm going to explain why I don't think so. First, on its face, I don't see why this should be at all convincing to anyone who takes suffering to be good or even decent evidence against God, whether they be an atheist or a theist. If there's data that seems to strongly conflict with a theory, it won't do to simply hand-wave it all away by appealing to mystery. If you could, then how could any theory be disconfirmed? Imagine you're a juror and are presented with what seems like strong evidence that someone is a serial killer. If the best that the defense can do is say, well, I know it looks like he is, but even though we can't understand it now, he's innocent, there would be no reason to be swayed away from making a judgment based on the facts that you do know. You've got it all wrong, some theists will want to say. Suffering doesn't count against theism nearly as much as you claim, if at all. Because of the distance between our intellect and God's, we should expect there to be tons of stuff we don't understand, including the kind, degree, and distribution of suffering. It's at least somewhat analogous to a toddler trying to understand their parents' reasons for allowing stuff that seems bad to them. The most obvious red flag is that this talking point is compatible with any amount of suffering imaginable. If we can't say that the Holocaust is good evidence against a good God because we're not in a position to make that judgment, then there's no clear way to stop this train. I might imagine a literal hellscape of a world, where for every biological creature, life consists of being born, suffering excruciatingly from moment to moment, and then dying upon arriving at their average lifespan. Surely this state of affairs would be a good reason to doubt the existence of a perfectly loving God. But those defending the previous line of reasoning, often referred to as skeptical theism, would have to reject this. Worse still, if we build this kind of absolute distance between our minds and God's into the God hypothesis, such that we can't even say that massive suffering counts against it, then what could we possibly say counts for it? John Danaher explains that on this view, one cannot accept any design-based arguments for the existence of God, be it in terms of biological design or cosmological fine-tuning. Both of those arguments are based on the idea that there are certain states of affairs, the existence of conscious, rational beings, that are good and that God would wish to realize. Put another way, if we would be so totally clueless about the mind of a tri-omni being, should one happen to exist, then how could we have any idea about what kinds of states of affairs he would probably realize? We couldn't. And if we can't, then arguably we can't say anything about what we would expect to see if theism were true, and thus can't identify what good evidence for theism even is. But let's circle back around to the parent-child analogy. If we should expect to be in the dark about many of God's reasons on our own, due to our limited capacities analogous to a toddler and parent, then we should also expect God to be a comforting presence during suffering, and to try to explain why it's happening in ways we could grasp, like any good parent would. But this at scale is not what we see. Plenty of people suffer without sensing a comforting divine presence, and we're left clueless about how specific instances of horrors fit into God's plan. A religious theist may want to say that there are good big-picture explanations in their holy text. Debatable. Even if so, tough luck for those born before your holy texts were written, I guess. There's also the question of whether people using these talking points have a blatant double standard. Theists. Suppose that I become convinced that an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly evil being exists, and you want to talk me out of it. Your first move is likely to be to try to argue that such an idea is incoherent. But let's say that going into the conversation, you already know that nothing you can say will convince me it is. What would be your next step? Well, probably to point to all the love, beauty, and goodness in the world as a means to cast serious doubt on that idea. This is not the type of world we would expect a maximally evil being to create, after all. But notice that I could just say something like, quote, "Evil God's fiendish intelligence is boundless, so we should expect there to be many goods, his evil reasons for which lie beyond our ken. In which case, the amount of good that exists is not good evidence that there is no such evil God." Would you accept that? I'm guessing probably not. And if you wouldn't, then it's time to stop using this reasoning to defend your God. Finally, skeptical theism is in conflict with common sense epistemology that most theists already accept. Here's Emerson Green explaining why this is a problem.
So this brings me to another objection to skeptical theism. I'm somewhat sympathetic to an idea called phenomenal conservatism, and as it turns out, so are many theists. The world seems a certain way to you. Until you've been given good reason to think otherwise, you're justified in thinking the world is how it seems. If suffering seems gratuitous, we're justified in thinking that it is gratuitous until we've been given reason to think otherwise, not just suggested that there might be reasons to think otherwise. Of course, there might be reasons we could be wrong. That could be said about any hypothesis that's ever been offered.
There are more objections to skeptical theism that are not covered here. So for those interested in more, see the links in the description. You may have noticed that earlier in the video, I appealed to the idea of an evil god to help theists see that they might be holding to a double standard. Doing this sort of thing can be very helpful in conversations with theists. And to find out how, tap this video next to me.